Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the work that we've been able to do together over many years. Hello, I'm Brad Sherman from California's best named city, Sherman Oaks. I came to Congress 20 years ago, and I focused on human rights and having a foreign policy that reflects American values. For that reason, I have made my career for 20 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm an active member of the International Religious Freedom Caucus, the Caucus on Religious Minorities in the Middle East, as well as, of course, the Armenian Caucus, and we've recently put together the Assyrian Caucus. We have seen the horrible images of death and destruction from Syria and Iraq, where ISIS and other terrorist groups have attacked ancient Christian communities. Nothing typifies the brutality of the Syrian civil war more than the images of victims, among them young children, gasping for breath as a result of gas attacks, fleeing ISIS as they approach a town or a village where they're forced to live in community, or forced to leave communities where their ancestors have lived for thousands of years. Today, the images of war in Syria come from the siege of Aleppo, which promises, unfortunately, to be a bloody battle for the control of that city. And all too often, it is Christians who are caught in the crossfire. Nothing typifies the assault on Christianity in Syria more than the abduction of the Greek Orthodox Archbishop back in 2013, and the simultaneous abduction of the Syriac Archbishop of Aleppo. Shortly thereafter, I organized a letter, and we got 20 of our colleagues to sign this, urging that the release of these two metropolitans be a very high priority of the United States. More recently, I joined with my colleague Dave Trott in introducing a resolution on behalf of the Assyrian, Chaldean, Yazidi, and Syriac Christian and Armenian communities, urging increased assistance to refugees in Syria and Iraq. And of course, I've been a consistent advocate of additional funding to help refugees. We are now up to $5 billion, but unfortunately the problem is even greater than that. There's been tremendous discussion in our country of refugees from Syria, and we have admitted over 10,000. The best research I've seen says that we have admitted only 56 Christians. America wants assurance that those we admit are not going to be Islamic extremists. There's one thing you can be certain of, whether we're talking about one Christian group or the other, whether we're talking about Syriac, whether we're talking about Chaldean, there's not a Muslim extremist among them. And certainly we ought to be in a position to assure people in the United States that we know the community that the refugee has come from, that we know the clergy from that community, that we have U.S. citizens who can vouch for the community, the clergy, and assure us that those we are admitting do not pose a threat here in America. I've co-sponsored of course, the bill that has now been carried into effect to create a special envoy to promote religious freedom and religious minorities in the Middle East. I have been pushing since 2014 for additional aid from USAID. And I should point out that the resolution that Dave Trott and I have introduced not only calls for concern, but calls for the administration to assure that the Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac Christians and Armenians are equipped and trained into security forces that can defend themselves. Because our goal, yes, one goal is taking care of those who have fled, But our ultimate goal should be that people don't have to flee the communities they've lived in for hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years. The issue is ISIS, and what do we do about it? And all too often we are given this false choice. Either we send in 300,000 American ground troops, or we do as little as we were doing last year. This is not the choice. We can arm self-defense forces on the Nineveh Plain. We can arm Christian communities in Syria. We can arm those elements in Syria that will fight for the values we believe in. And we can do more than that. Yes, we've had a bombing campaign, and everybody talks about that campaign. It is a tiny fragment of what we have done when we were serious about the war in Iraq, either the first or the second. We can do far more, both in quantity but also in terms of our rules of engagement. Our rules of engagement have said, if you see a moving tanker filled with ISIS oil, don't bomb it, unless you can ask the driver whether he is a civilian or part of the ISIS military. And so few of those drivers respond to any such query. What did we do when we were serious in World War II? France was occupied by terrible and evil forces, and our hearts were with the French people. And if we saw an oil truck moving, we bombed it. Unfortunately, thousands of French civilians died in that bombing, and then they greeted us as liberators because they knew that that bombing was necessary to set them free from the Nazis. We have to be just as serious in going after ISIS. We have to hit the trucks. I'm not saying we deliberately hit civilians. We do everything possible to avoid hitting civilians. I'm not saying we carpet bomb. But we cannot have rules of engagement that say we don't hit strategic targets. Where there are refineries, we hit them. When there are lines of trucks waiting to fill for oil, we should hit them. Gradually, we have moved in this direction. And I hope to see Mosul and Raqqa liberated in the next 6 months. But think of what we could have done if we had adopted these programs years ago. The rules of engagement are controversial because there's a moral question. What if you kill one civilian in the bombing? What if we had failed to do the bombing attacks we did in France and the Nazis had maintained power for 6 more months or 1 year or 2 years longer in Europe? How many people would die? And the moral responsibility is on America, not just for the one civilian who dies in a bombing raid, but for the thousands of rapes and torture and murder and beheading that happen if we allow ISIS to continue to occupy Mosul and Raqqa and the land in between for months and years longer than necessary. So I look forward to an aggressive American effort against ISIS, and I look forward to the defense of Christians in the Middle East being something that is beyond question, bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans working together. I'm Brad Sherman. Thank you very much.